In the military, silence isn't fear, it's a state of combat readiness. In toxic families, it's the same. There are two kinds of daughters who stay silent: those who do it to obey and those who do it to remember. Arrogant parents usually make the fatal mistake of confusing the two. I'm Sergeant Poppy Rose. At exactly 9:03 a.m. on the day I turned 21, my mother pushed a folder across the breakfast table like it was a plate of cold pancakes. She smiled that sweet, practiced smile of hers. "Just some paperwork so I can manage your trust fund while you're deployed, honey." She didn't know the soldier sitting across from her already knew the play. Before I take you inside that suffocating kitchen, hit like and subscribe. It helps me more than you think. And don't forget to drop the name of your city in the comments. Now, let me take you back 6 months. The day I opened my grandfather's cedar box and realized I was walking straight into an ambush called family. October in Willow Creek, Pennsylvania, feels like a funeral that never ends. The red brick houses look respectable from the curb, but behind those manicured lawns, the dead is piling up like dead leaves. I was home on leave, swapping the dust of Poland for the damp chill of the Northeast. The house smelled like cinnamon and bleach. My mother, Caroline, has this habit of scrubbing everything until it's raw whenever she's hiding something. It's an old trick. Overclean the surface so no one looks at the rot underneath. I spent my first 3 days back in my childhood bedroom, moving with the quiet precision the Army hammered into my bones. I didn't argue. I didn't complain about the drafty windows. I just watched. I was clearing out the bottom of my old closet, pushing aside boxes of high school junk, when my hand hit something solid. Cold. Aromatic. The cedar box. Grandpa Harold had given it to me the day I shipped out for basic training. He was an old-school accountant, a man who lived by the ledger and died by the truth. He'd looked at me that day with eyes as sharp as a combat knife and told me to keep it safe. I hadn't looked inside it since the funeral. I pulled it out and sat on the floor. The wood felt dry and rough under my calloused thumb. I flipped the lid. Under a thin layer of faded blue velvet lay a single white envelope, sealed tight with a blob of heavy red wax. My name was written across the front in Harold's jagged, old man scrawl. I miasted my thumb over the seal. "Only open if you feel something's wrong with your mother before your birthday. Call David Caldwell." A cold knot tightened in my gut. Harold didn't do maybe. He didn't do drama. He saw through numbers and he saw through liars. If he left this, the math was already wrong. I felt the urge to rip the wax off right then, to tear into whatever ghost story he'd left for me. Then, I heard it, a whisper. It drifted up through the thin oak floorboards, rising from the kitchen like swamp gas. My mother's voice. It was stripped of the honey she uses when I'm in the room. Now, it was frantic, pressed thin. "Mark, keep it down. She's upstairs." Then came the grumble of my stepfather, Mark Hollis. I heard the heavy thud of a beer bottle hitting the counter, followed by the sharp, aggressive rustle of legal-size paper being shoved around. "Just get the terms ready," Mark growled. His voice sounded like gravel in a blender. "The kid's a grunt. She ain't gonna know the first thing about law. She'll sign whatever you put in front of her." My hand froze on the red wax. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. In the field, when you hear the click of a safety in the brush, you don't go poking your head out to see who's there. You stay small. You merge with the shadows. You synchronize your heartbeat with the silence until you own the terrain. I wasn't a daughter anymore. I was a target in an exclusion zone. I didn't break the seal. Not yet. If they were setting an ambush, I needed to know the layout of the kill box before I tripped the wire. I carefully slid the envelope back into the cedar box and shoved it deep into the corner of the closet, hidden under a pile of old Army fatigues. I stood up, my movements fluid and soundless. I didn't turn on the light. I walked to the window and pulled back the lace curtain just enough to see the street. Down in the driveway sat Mark's Ford F350. It was a massive, overcompensating beast of a truck, gleaming under the weak yellow streetlights. It was a $60,000 lie on 4 wheels, probably paid for with credit he didn't have. I looked at that truck and realized my mother wasn't cleaning the house because she missed me. She was cleaning it because she was prepping the site for a harvest. My grandfather had seen it coming. He'd known that to people like Mark and Caroline, I wasn't a person. I was just a six-figure trust fund with a uniform. I leaned my forehead against the cold glass. The family I'd come home to was just another hostile force, and I'd just stepped into their crosshairs. But there's one thing they forgot. You don't try to roll a sergeant who spent her life spotting mines. I reached over and clicked the lock on my bedroom door. The sound was a sharp, final snick in the quiet room. The leave was over. The operation had officially begun. March in Pennsylvania is just mud and disappointment. The ground is a slushy, gray mess, and the sky looks like a bruised lung. Inside the house in Willow Creek, the air was even heavier. The radiator in the dining room was rattling like it had a loose tooth, a steady, annoying clack, clack, clack that filled the gaps between our heavy breaths. Mark was already 2 cans deep into a pack of cheap Bud Light. His face flushed that ugly, blotchy shade of red that usually meant he was looking for someone to kick. I sat there in my faded army tee, the one with the collar starting to fray from too many wash cycles in base laundry. My skin felt tight. My back was straight, habit mostly. The army drills it into you until your spine forgets how to slouch. I was eating meatloaf that tasted like wet cardboard and grease, while my mother, Caroline, sat across from me, her eyes darting toward the front door every few seconds. Then, the front door slammed. Skylar walked in, the cold dampness clinging to her expensive North Face jacket. She didn't say hello. She didn't look at me. She just marched to the table and tossed a thick red envelope right into the middle of the spread. It landed with a smug little thud next to the gravy boat. Bucknell University. "I'm in," Skylar said. Her voice was flat, but her eyes were bright with a kind of greedy victory. My mother didn't just smile. She performed. She let out a gasp that sounded like she'd just seen a miracle, lunging across the table to pull Skylar into a suffocating hug. Carolyn's eyes were glistening with those practiced tears she keeps in her back pocket. "Oh my God! Bucknell!" Carolyn cried, her voice hitting a pitch that made the windows vibrate. $65,000 a year, plus the dorms, plus the meal plan. She pulled back, gripping Skylar's shoulders like she was holding onto a winning lottery ticket. "Don't you worry about a single dime, honey. We are going to take care of it all. You won't have to carry a cent of debt, not one." I kept chewing. The meatloaf was dry, sticking to the roof of my mouth. No one asked how my week was at the base. No one asked about the double shifts I'd been pulling in the motor pool or the hazard pay I'd been stacking away, dollar by dollar, into a savings account they didn't know existed. To them, I wasn't a daughter or a soldier. I was just a piece of the scenery that occasionally brought home a paycheck. Mark finished his can, crushed the thin aluminum in his fist with a sharp crackle, and let out a burp that smelled like sour yeast and bad intentions. He wiped the foam from his upper lip with the back of a hand that still had construction grease under the nails. Then he locked his eyes on me. "What about you, Poppy?" he sneered. His voice was gravelly, mocking. "Still planning on rotting in those tents and mud? A girl like you, running around with a rifle, it ain't exactly a career. It's a joke. You're playing dress-up while Skylar's out here building a real life." He leaned forward, the chair creaking under his weight. "Family money should stay in the family, you know? Managed by people who actually live here, not tucked away in some vault where some suit of a lawyer can skim off the top. You're a grunt. You don't know the first thing about managing a portfolio." The air in the room got thick, like we were all breathing through wet wool. I didn't blink. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a flinch or a snarky comeback. I just put my fork down. The metal scraped against the porcelain plate, a sharp screeching sound that made Skylar wince and look away. Caroline saw the temperature in the room dropping and went into her peacemaker routine. She reached over, her hand fluttering through the air like a dying bird, and patted the back of my hand. Her fingers were ice, not just cold, empty. "Now, Mark, don't be like that," she said, her voice dropping into that syrupy, manipulative tone. "Our Poppy is almost 21. She's a grown woman." She squeezed my hand, her grip surprisingly tight. "The closer we get to that birthday, the more we really have to start thinking about the future as a family. Right, honey. I looked her dead in the eyes. I saw the way the skin was stretched too tight over her cheekbones, her smile frozen and fake, like a cracked porcelain doll. It wasn't a mother's look. It was the look of a predator checking the wind. In the army, they teach you how to read a map. You look for the signs, the terrain, the markers. You learn to spot the difference between a friendly campfire and a muzzle flash. Closer to that birthday wasn't a celebration. It was an artillery coordinate. They weren't planning a party for me. They were planning a heist. Skylar wouldn't look at me. She kept her eyes glued to her plate, stabbing a piece of potato over and over until it was mush. She knew. She was the reason they needed the cash. She was the motive for the crime they were about to commit. Have you ever sat at a dinner table where you felt like a stranger in your own house? Where your sacrifice was ignored while someone else's greed was treated like a holiday? If you've ever been the one they tried to squeeze for every dime while they looked you in the face and called it love, hit that like button. I want to know who's standing with me in the mud. Drop a comment with the word silence if you know exactly what it feels like to watch an ambush happen in slow motion. The rattling radiator finally stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was heavy, expectant, and sharp. I felt the clock start ticking in my head, a countdown they couldn't hear. They thought I was the prey. They thought I was the stupid grunt who would sign anything for a bit of fake affection. I picked up my fork again. The meatloaf was still cold. The house was still a trap. But they had no idea that the girl sitting at their table wasn't just a daughter anymore. The soldier was officially on duty. The snow in Pennsylvania doesn't just fall. It suffocates. By late January, Willow Creek was buried under a thick, dirty crust of ice that turned the neighborhood into a graveyard of rusted sedans and gray slush. I spent my days watching the driveway from the shadows of my bedroom, a ghost in my own house. Strange men started appearing, mostly suits, but not the good kind. The kind of guys who wore cheap cologne to hide the smell of a failing career. One guy kept showing up when Mark was at work, Lance Briggs. He drove a black Cadillac with a dent in the rear bumper and carried a cream-colored leather briefcase that looked like it cost more than his soul. My mother, Caroline, called him an insurance adjuster. She smiled when she said it, that sweet, practiced tilt of the head. I didn't buy it. I used a DMV contact from the base to run his plates. Briggs wasn't adjusting insurance. He was a bottom-feeder real estate lawyer who'd narrowly dodged a disbarment hearing last spring. The vultures were circling the kitchen table, and they weren't interested in the leftovers. They were moving fast. I could feel the air in the house getting thinner, like the oxygen was being sucked out to make room for their lies. Then came the blizzard. A whiteout that turned the world into a blinding, screaming void. My training schedule at the base got scrubbed, giving us an unexpected 48-hour pass. I didn't call home. I didn't text. I caught a ride with a transport truck and walked the last mile through the knee-deep drifts. My boots hit the frozen ground with a steady, rhythmic crunch, crunch, crunch. I didn't use the front door. I went through the side gate, moving like a shadow against the white. The garage door was cracked open an inch, letting out the gray exhaust from Mark's idling F350. I slipped inside, the heat from the engine hitting my face like a physical blow. The air tasted of diesel and stale Marlboros. I stood there, blending into the darkness behind a stack of rusted winter tires, my heart steady. My breathing synced to the low thrum of the truck. That's when I heard them. The door leading into the kitchen was ajar. Lance says the co-management agreement is the only way to lock it down, my mother whispered. Her voice was stripped of that honeyed layer she used for me. It was sharp, desperate. He'll handle the filing. Once she signs the power of attorney, we move the trust assets into the LLC. Mark, the bank is calling every day. We can't miss this birthday window. Mark's heavy work boots thudded on the linoleum. I heard the fridge open, then the sharp clack of a beer bottle cap hitting the counter. She's a soldier, Caroline, he growled. They train him to spot an ambush a mile away. What if she starts digging? What if she smells the rat before we get the ink on the page? My mother let out a dry, jagged laugh. It was a sound that made the hair on my neck stand up. Poppy will sign. She's always been the good little soldier, obedient, quiet. She's so starved for a mother's love she'd sign her own death warrant if I just hugged her first. She's stupid enough to think this is about her future. Trust me, she'll do exactly what she's told. The words didn't just hurt, they were a gut punch that left me hollow. My mother didn't see a daughter. She saw a mark, a sucker. A paycheck to cover for a stepfather who couldn't balance a checkbook if his life depended on it. I didn't storm in. I didn't scream. I just turned around and walked back out into the screaming wind. I hiked 3 blocks to the town park, a desolate patch of frozen dirt and rusted swings that screeched like dying birds in the storm. I sat on a bench, the snow piling up on my shoulders, and pulled Grandpa Harold's cedar box out of my rucksack. My fingers were stiff from the cold, but my hands were steady. That was the army in me. When the world catches fire, you get colder. I pulled out the white envelope. The red wax seal was a dark, ugly stain against the white snow. I didn't use a knife. I dug my thumb under the wax and ripped it open. The paper tore with a violent, sharp sound that cut through the wind. Peanut, if you're reading this, you already know. Don't let them take what's yours. You have the right to protect yourself. You're in Everett, we don't surrender to thieves. Taped to the bottom was a business card. David Caldwell. I pulled out my phone. My breath was a thick, white cloud that disappeared into the gray sky. I hit the numbers. Caldwell, the voice answered. It was deep, solid, like a slab of granite that wouldn't budge for anything. This is Poppy Rose, I said. My voice was a flat line. I told him everything. The garage, the LLC, the lawyer with the dented Cadillac. I told him how my mother laughed about how easy I'd be to break. There was a long silence on the other end. I heard a match strike, then the low exhale of someone who'd been waiting for a war to start. I've been waiting for this call for 5 years, Poppy, Caldwell said. His voice was an iron command. Your grandfather briefed me before he went into the ground. He knew they'd come for the trust. What's the move? I asked. Listen to me, Sergeant, Caldwell said. From this second forward, you are a ghost. You don't change your schedule. You don't change your face. You don't ask them a single damn question. You walk back into that house, you eat their meatloaf, and you look your mother in the eye like you're still her good little soldier. We go to radio silence. Do you understand? I looked at the snow-covered swings, the metal chains shivering in the blizzard. Roger that, sir, I said. I hung up and stared at the dark screen. The ambush was set. They thought I was walking into their kill box. They had no idea I just turned the entire map against them. I stood up, shouldered my rucksack, and headed back toward the house. The good little soldier was coming home. And she wasn't alone. David Caldwell's office smelled like a place where secrets went to die. It was a cramped space tucked away in a soot-stained building in downtown Pittsburgh, filled with the thick scent of stale paper and coffee that had been burning on the burner since 6 a.m. There was no polished marble here, no fancy walnut desks or expensive leather chairs, just old, scarred oak and the steady, annoying hum of flickering fluorescent lights that cast a sickly pallor over the stacks of yellowed manila folders. It was a room built for utility, not for show, which was exactly why Harold had trusted him. Caldwell sat behind a mountain of paperwork that looked like a landslide waiting to happen. His face looked like it was carved out of a Pennsylvania hillside, hard, lined, and unmoving. He didn't offer me a seat. He didn't offer me sugar or cream for the black sludge he'd poured into a chipped mug that had a "World's Okayest Lawyer" logo fading on the side. He just slid a manila folder across the wood. A girl at Briggs's office has a conscience, Caldwell said. His voice was a low rumble, the kind of sound that felt like a heavy iron door closing in a basement. She saw what they were drafting, didn't like the smell of it. She waited until Briggs went to lunch, made a copy, and brought it to me. I leaned forward, my spine a rigid steel rod. I didn't touch the coffee. I didn't want to be comforted. I opened the folder. The header was printed in a bold, clinical font that made my eyes ache. Everett Family Financial Unity Agreement. I ran my finger over the words. Unity. It's a funny word. In the military, Unity means you die for the guy next to you because you believe in the person, not just the uniform. In that kitchen in Willow Creek, it meant they wanted me to bleed out so they could stay warm. It was a word used by thieves to make their theft look like a virtue. Page 3, Caldwell grunted. That's where they bury the body. I flipped the page. The ink was dark, the language sharp and cold. Clause 3. It was a masterclass in legal robbery. It granted Caroline full, unrestricted power of attorney over all my financial assets, including the trust Harold had left me. The reason they cited? My frequent absence due to military service. They were using my uniform as a reason to lock me in a cage. They were making my service to the country a liability. But that wasn't the worst part. The document dictated that all trust disbursements would be automatically funneled into an entity called Hollis Everett Holdings, LLC. I looked at the bottom of the page, my vision narrowing. The sole manager of the LLC, Mark Hollis. My stomach did a slow, nauseating flip. They weren't just asking for a loan. They were setting up a permanent pipeline. $600,000. The money my grandfather spent 50 years stacking while he wore out his shoes as a clerk, was being prepared to bail out a deadbeat contractor who was currently drowning in bad debt and back taxes. Mark wanted to play big-time builder with my blood and my grandfather's sweat. Look at the date, Poppy, Caldwell said, tapping the corner of the paper with a cheap, chewed-up ballpoint pen. February 28th. I sat back, the air in the small office feeling heavy and stagnant. My 21st birthday was in April. That's the day the trust was supposed to unlock. The day Harold's lockbox finally opened for me. They weren't waiting for the door to open. They were trying to get me to hand over the keys while the lock was still turning in the door. They wanted me to sign away my entire future 2 months before I even owned it. It was legal suicide. A professional, calculated execution of my independence. In the Army, I sign my name to papers that say I'm willing to catch a bullet for a flag. I sign for my gear. I sign for my life. But here, in this quiet, dusty room, my own mother was asking me to sign a paper that said I didn't matter. That I was just a ghost with a bank account they could drain. The flickering lights above us hummed louder, a jagged sound that grated on my nerves. My hands didn't shake, but I could feel the cold rage settling into my marrow, turning my blood to slush. They think I'm still the kid who'll do what I'm told because it's for the family, I said. My voice didn't sound like mine. It was flat, empty, like a hollow shell. Are you? Caldwell asked. He wasn't judging. He was just checking the temperature. I reached into the pocket of my jacket and pulled out my tactical pen. It was a heavy piece of aircraft-grade aluminum, black and scarred from use in the field. I clicked it. The sound was sharp. Final. Like a seer engaging on a rifle. Build the fortress, David, I said. Caldwell nodded. For the next 2 hours, the room was silent except for the scratch of pens and the rustle of paper. We weren't just drafting a trust. We were digging a trench. We were pouring concrete. We called it the Margaret Trust, named after my grandmother, the only woman in that family who knew how to hold a line when things got ugly. It was irrevocable. That was the first brick. Once the money moved, not even a Supreme Court justice could touch it without my say-so. We set up third-party management, a firm in New York, cold, professional. People who didn't give a damn about family unity or doing what's right for Skylar. Then I dictated Clause 7. I leaned over the desk, watching the words hit the paper. Permanent exclusion. I had Caldwell underline it in red ink. It barred Caroline, Mark Hollis, and Skylar Hollis from ever being beneficiaries, managers, or even consultants. They were banned from the money, banned from the legacy. If they ever try to touch this LLC or come near your base for money, Caldwell said, stamping the final page with a heavy rubber stamp that hit the oak desk with a satisfying, echoing thump, they're walking into a legal buzzsaw. I looked at the stack of documents. The Margaret Trust was a fortress, built out of ink and ironclad clauses. It was done. The weapon was loaded and aimed, but the operation wasn't over. I had to go back. I had to look at Mark's smug face and listen to Caroline's honey-coated lies for 48 more hours. I had to be the prey. I had to let them think they were winning. I stood up, my spine cracking with a dull sound. I looked out the window at the gray, unforgiving Pittsburgh sky. I have to play the part, I said. 2 days, Poppy, Caldwell said. 2 days of silence. Don't trip the wire. I nodded. I picked up my rucksack and walked out into the cold. The fortress was built. Now, I just had to wait for them to charge the walls. The silence wasn't fear anymore. It was the quiet before the explosion. The Willow Creek Country Club smelled like expensive chlorine and the sickly sweet scent of buttercream frosting that made the back of my throat itch. It's the kind of place where people pay thousands of dollars a year to pretend they aren't drowning in credit card debt. 2 days before my 21st birthday, my mother, Caroline, decided it was the perfect time for a celebration. She was wearing a silk dress that probably cost more than my monthly base pay, floating between tables like a ghost in a high-end boutique. I sat there in a stiff-collared shirt that felt like a noose, nodding whenever some stranger in a blazer told me, "Thank you for your service." My back was a straight line, my eyes scanning the room the way I'd scan a perimeter. Across the room, tucked into a corner booth, I spotted Lance Briggs. He was chewing on a Caesar salad, his eyes cold and predatory behind his glasses. He caught Mark's eye and gave a small, almost invisible nod as he raised his water glass. The predator was in position. The snare was set, and they thought I was the only one who hadn't seen the wire. Mark sat next to me, his fingers drumming a restless, erratic rhythm on the white linen tablecloth. Every time the server walked by with a tray of drinks, Mark's eyes followed them with a desperate, hungry look. He was a man holding onto a sinking ship, looking for someone else's life jacket to steal. Carolyn finally cleared her throat, tapping a silver spoon against her crystal wine glass. The sound was sharp, like a needle scratching across a record. The room went quiet, the kind of heavy silence you find in a courtroom right before a sentence is read. "Everyone, if I could have your attention," Carolyn said, her voice dropping into that syrupy, sweet tone she used whenever she was about to lie. She walked over and draped an arm around my shoulders, squeezing tight. The smell of her perfume, something floral and expensive, hit me like a wave of exhaust. Tomorrow, our little Poppy turns 21. As a soldier, she's used to making tough calls on the front lines, but back home, she's still our girl. She's got some big financial decisions ahead of her while she's deployed, but she doesn't have to worry. Family is the ultimate safety net. The crowd broke into a chorus of polite applause, their faces blurred by the dim, warm lighting of the club. It was a masterpiece of gaslighting. She was setting the stage, telling the world she was the heroic mother. So no one would ask questions when my trust fund started paying for Skylar's tuition and Mark's back taxes. They weren't celebrating my life. They were prepping the harvest. I looked down at the asparagus on my plate and decided to play the part. I let my shoulders slump just an inch, making my eyes go wide and soft, the way I used to look before I learned how to strip a rifle in the dark. "Does the paperwork take a long time, Mark?" I asked, my voice small, almost timid. "I'm real bad with all those bank forms and legal talk. It's a lot different than the motor pool." Mark's eyes lit up like a gambler who'd just seen a winning card. He let out a loud bark-like laugh and clapped me on the back so hard I felt my teeth rattle. "Don't you worry your head about that, kid. I've already cleared the path. One signature, and it's all handled. Those lawyers just want to bleed you dry with fees. You gotta keep it in the family where it belongs." I caught Skylar's reflection in the silverware. She was sitting directly across from me, her face pale under the club's chandelier. She wasn't eating. She was using her fork to systematically shred a piece of Atlantic salmon into pink mush, her eyes fixed on the tablecloth. She knew that $65,000 tuition bill at Bucknell was being written in my blood, and she couldn't even look me in the eye. The party dragged on for another hour, a blur of fake smiles and hollow toasts. When the last guest finally left, we walked out into the freezing Pennsylvania night. The drive back to Willow Creek was dead quiet. The only sound the hum of tires on the asphalt and Mark's heavy, beer-scented breathing. The perfect middle-class family, returning to their perfect brick home. They thought the con was over. They thought the stupid grunt was safely in the pen. Inside, the house felt like a tomb. I walked upstairs without saying a word, the oak stairs creaking under my boots. I walked into my room, locked the door, and didn't turn on the light. I sat on the edge of my bed, watching the red numbers on my digital alarm clock. 11:43 p.m. 11:44 p.m. In the military, we call it the line of departure. The moment you leave your cover and move into the kill zone. My mother was probably downstairs right now, checking the pen she wanted me to use, her face thick with foundation and lies. She thought she was the one in control. 11:45 p.m. The air in the room felt electric, humming with a tension that made my skin crawl. I pulled my laptop from my rucksack and set it on the desk. The blue light from the screen hit my face, cold and unforgiving. 15 minutes until I became a ghost. 15 minutes until the family I'd spent 20 years trying to love found out exactly what happens when you try to ambush a soldier in her own home. The clock flickered. The trap was lubricated and ready. But I wasn't the one who was going to be caught in it. Midnight was crawling toward Willow Creek like a slow-moving freight train, heavy and inevitable. It was April 14th, the tail end of a Pennsylvania spring that still felt like a graveyard. Inside the house, the air was thick, stagnant, and smelled of the leftover grease from a dinner I hadn't touched. I reached out and slid the brass bolt on my bedroom door. Click. A small, sharp sound, a finality. I turned the lock on the knob for good measure, making sure the perimeter was sealed tight. I pulled the heavy curtains shut, overlapping the fabric until not even a sliver of the pale streetlights could bleed through. The room was a total blackout zone, exactly how I needed it to be for this operation. The house was quiet, but it wasn't silent. From downstairs, through the thin oak floorboards, I could hear the wet, rhythmic rattle of Mark's snoring. It was a guttural, arrogant sound, the noise of a man who slept well because he didn't have a conscience to keep him awake. He was probably passed out in his recliner, dreaming about the new equipment he was going to buy with money that didn't belong to him. Beside him, in the next room over, my mother was likely dreaming of Bucknell tuition and silk dresses. They were sleeping on a foundation of lies, totally unaware that the floor was about to give way. I sat at the small desk, the one with the scratched wood and the cigarette burn from some previous tenant. I flipped open my laptop. The fan started to whir, a low, mechanical hum that felt like the only honest thing in the entire house. The blue light from the screen hit my face, cold and ghastly pale. It made my skin look like a corpse's, but I didn't care. I felt more alive than I had in years. I plugged in my encrypted headset and pulled up the security software David Caldwell had sent me. My heart was thumping against my ribs. Heavy, slow, like a bass drum in an empty hall. I wasn't scared, I was focused. This wasn't a birthday party, it was a digital extraction. The screen flickered and 3 boxes appeared on the encrypted Zoom call at exactly 11:52 p.m. In the center was David Caldwell. He was sitting in that dusty office of his, a single desk lamp casting long shadows behind him. He looked like an old bulldog guarding a gate. To his left was a man in a crisp white shirt from Midland Trust. To his right was an online notary from Harrisburg, a woman with tired eyes and a stack of digital forms. Nobody smiled. Nobody made small talk about the weather or the fact that it was technically a holiday for me. This wasn't a celebration. It was a surgical strike. We were all cogs in a machine designed to move 6 figures through the digital ether before the sun came up. "Everything is staged, Sergeant," Caldwell said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp in my ear, steady as a steel anchor. "The notary has verified your identity through the military database. The bank rep has the transfer codes on standby. Now we wait for the clock. Not a second before, Poppy. The law's a precise bitch. We give them 0 room to breathe." I stared at the corner of my screen. 8 minutes. Those minutes felt like hours. I could hear the ticking of the digital clock on my wall, each second feeling like a hammer hitting a nail. Downstairs, Mark let out a particularly loud snort and shifted in his sleep. I stayed still. My back was a straight line. I didn't fidget. I didn't bite my lip. I just watched the numbers change. 56, 57, 58, 10 seconds left. My fingers hovered over the plastic keys. I could feel the texture of the Q and the W under my tips. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 0 hours, 0 minutes, 0 seconds. I was 21 years old. According to the state of Pennsylvania and the ironclad ledger of Harold's will, I was no longer a ward. I wasn't a minor. I was the law. Go, Caldwell whispered. I didn't hesitate. I moved the cursor to the first signature block. The blue light flared as I started typing, Quinn Marie Everett. Each letter felt like a physical blow. I wasn't just signing a document. I was killing Poppy, the obedient little girl they thought they could bleed dry. I was becoming Quinn, the soldier, the woman who owned herself. I hit the enter key. Clack. The sound was loud in the small room, a gunshot in the dark. I moved to the next block, Quinn Marie Everett. I could almost feel the invisible chains snapping, the heavy rusted links of family loyalty falling away and hitting the floor. I signed the third form. The co-management agreement they'd drafted for me was a ghost now. It didn't exist. It was garbage. Every keystroke was a hammer blow shattering the iron links that bound me. My name was my weapon. By 12:04 a.m., the online notary's digital seal hit the screen with a faint ping. A green progress bar appeared on the bank's portal. It started to crawl. 10%, 40%, 70%. I held my breath, watching that bar like it was a life support monitor. The number at the top, $681,412.90, wasn't just money. It was every hour Harold had spent working himself to the bone. It was the insurance money my father had left that she'd already stolen once. It was my future. 100%. Transaction complete. The status changed to irrevocable. The Margaret Trust was a steel vault now, and I was the only one with the combination. Caldwell looked directly into the camera, a small, hard smile touching the corners of his mouth. "Happy birthday, Quinn," he said. "The world belongs to you now. Get some sleep. You've earned it." I slapped the laptop lid shut. The blue light disappeared, leaving me in the pitch-black room. I sat there in the dark, listening to Mark snoring downstairs. He sounded pathetic now, like a man who didn't know his house was already on fire. Have you ever had to sit in the dark and realize that the only person coming to save you was yourself? Have you ever had to cut a blood tie just to keep from drowning? If you've ever had to be your own hero when the people who raised you were the villains, hit that like button. I need to know I'm not the only one who had to fight a war in their own bedroom. Comment the word freedom if you know exactly how it feels to finally own your own name. I leaned back against the wall, my heart finally slowing down. The battle was over, the fortress was locked, but morning was coming, and at 9:03 a.m., my mother was going to walk into that kitchen with a plate of pancakes and a pen. I couldn't wait to see her face. The house in Willow Creek smelled like maple syrup and desperation. At 7:45 a.m., the kitchen was bathed in a weak, watery sunlight that caught the dust motes dancing over the linoleum. Caroline was already at the stove, humming some upbeat tune that didn't match the cold sharpness in her eyes. She was wearing a floral apron over her silk blouse, looking every bit the suburban matriarch. She turned around with a plate of pancakes, a single blue candle flickering in the center. "Happy birthday, honey," she chirped. The sweetness in her voice was so thick it felt like it could clog my lungs. She leaned in and pressed a dry, rehearsed kiss against my cheek. I sat there in my gray turtleneck, my back a rigid line against the wooden chair. Beside the plate, sitting right next to the butter, was a brown leather folder. It looked heavy. It looked like a tombstone. I didn't smile. I didn't say, "Thank you." I just leaned forward and blew out the candle. A thin gray ribbon of smoke curled up into the air, vanishing against the white ceiling. The house was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the heavy, uneven breathing of Mark Hollis sitting across from me. He was already nursing a mug of black coffee, his eyes darting between me and that folder like a stray dog watching a bone. At exactly 9:03 a.m., Caroline sat down and pushed the folder across the table. Her hand stayed on top of it for a second too long, her manicured nails digging into the leather. "It's just some small stuff, sweetheart," she said, her voice dropping into that low, manipulative purr. "Just some paperwork so I can manage the trust for you while you're deployed. You've got enough to worry about with the Army. Let your mother handle the heavy lifting back home." I picked up my fork, but I didn't touch the pancakes. I don't like sugar when I'm in a kill zone. I opened the folder. The paper felt crisp, expensive, and utterly heartless. I started reading. I didn't rush. I let the silence stretch until it became a physical weight in the room. 2 minutes. 3. Mark's heavy work boots started drumming against the floorboards under the table. A dull, rhythmic thud that betrayed his nerves. He cleared his throat, a sharp, grating sound like sandpaper on glass. "Just sign the damn thing, Poppy," Mark growled. He checked his heavy stainless steel watch, another thing he probably couldn't afford. "I gotta get to the job site. The crews are waiting. We don't have all morning for you to play lawyer." I didn't look up. My finger traced the ink on page 3. "Section 4.2, I said. My voice was a flat, dead line. "This clause authorizes the immediate transfer of trust principal into an entity called Hollis Everett Holdings, LLC. That's your company, isn't it, Mark?" The kitchen went cold. The radiator gave a lonely, metallic hiss. Caroline's smile didn't slip, but it hardened into something that looked like cracked porcelain. "It's just for tax optimization, honey," she said quickly, her fingers fluttering toward her throat. "Briggs said it's the best way to shield the assets from the government. We're trying to protect you." I flipped to the final signature page and let out a short, jagged breath that might have been a laugh if I still knew how to do it. "This document was drafted on December 14th, I said, looking directly at Mark. 4 months ago. Back when you were telling me how proud you were of my service over Christmas dinner, you already had Briggs and Associates drawing up the papers to gut my future. I saw Briggs at the club 2 nights ago. Mark, I saw the way he looked at you. The way you both looked at me like I was a prize heifer at the county fair." Mark's face turned a violent, blotchy red. He slammed his fist onto the table, making the coffee in his mug jump and spill over the rim. "You think you're so damn smart, don't you?" he hissed, leaning over the table until I could smell the stale tobacco on his breath. "You're a grunt. You're meat for the machine. That money is doing nothing sitting in a vault while my business is on the line. You owe this family. You owe us for every year we put a roof over your head." My phone, sitting face up on the table, started to vibrate. The screen lit up with a name that made both of them freeze. David Caldwell, Esquire. I hit the speaker button. The voice that came through was deep, resonant, and carried the weight of a gavel hitting wood. "Confirming the final lockdown, Quinn," Caldwell said. He didn't use the name Poppy. He used the name on the trust. The transaction was verified at 12:04 a.m. The full $681,412 is officially secured within the Margaret Trust. It is now legally unreachable. Caldwell paused, and I could almost hear the scratch of his pen in his Pittsburgh office. "Mrs. Hollis," he continued, his voice as cold as a Pennsylvania winter. "I have already prepared the filing for breach of fiduciary duty, and as of 8 a.m. this morning, I have submitted a formal complaint to the Pennsylvania Bar Association to have Lance Briggs stripped of his license for legal malpractice and collusion. The papers sitting on your kitchen table are nothing but expensive scrap paper. Do not contact my client again." The line went dead. The silence that followed was absolute. Mark sat back, his mouth hanging open, the red in his face draining away until he looked gray and old. Caroline's hand went to her chest, her breathing coming in short, ragged gasps. She looked at the pancakes, then at me, her eyes filling with a sudden, desperate panic. The mask was gone. There was nothing left but the rot. I stood up, pushing the chair back with a slow, deliberate screech. I looked at the folder, then at the 2 predators who had finally run out of teeth. "The breakfast was a nice touch, Caroline," I said. "But you oversweetened the syrup." I turned my head and looked toward the hallway where Skylar was standing in the shadows, her eyes wide with a different kind of terror. The girl whose tuition was supposed to be paid for with my life. I wasn't done yet. The silence in the kitchen wasn't the peaceful kind you find in a church on a Tuesday morning. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a grave right before the dirt hits the coffin. Caroline sat there, her manicured fingers trembling against her throat. Then, the dam broke. But it wasn't a flood of regret. It was a calculated performance. A single dark tear escaped her eye, carving a messy path through her expensive foundation. She started to hitch her breath, a jagged, practiced sound that used to make me run to her with a glass of water when I was 10. Now, it just sounded like a bad engine trying to turn over in the cold. After everything I've done, she choked out. Her voice was thin, a pathetic rasp that lacked any real weight. I sacrificed my youth for you, Poppy. I gave you this home. I tried to keep this family together while you were halfway across the world playing soldier. This is how you repay me? By calling some shark of a lawyer to gut your own mother? I didn't blink. I sat there with my hands flat on the oak table, feeling the grain of the wood under my palms. In the army, when a buddy is bleeding out in the dirt, you do whatever it takes to save them. You don't ask questions. But when a traitor starts leaking crocodile tears, you don't offer a bandage. You just stay quiet and count your ammunition. I didn't gut you, Caroline, I said. My voice was a flat, gray line. I just locked the vault. You're the one who tried to pick the lock. I reached over and flipped the brown leather folder to page 9. I read the line out loud, my voice cutting through her sobbing like a serrated blade. Full tuition payment for Skylar Ann Hollis at Bucknell University, including housing, meal plans, and a miscellaneous Greek life allowance. I looked towards the hallway. Skylar was still standing there, her shadow stretching long and thin across the linoleum. She looked small, pathetic. She was wearing a Bucknell sweatshirt that probably cost $80 of my hazard pay. 12 years, I said, looking back at the two of them. That's how long you've been prepping the ground for this. You didn't raise me to be a daughter. You raised me to be the insurance policy for Skylar's brand. You were gonna bury me under a mountain of legal debt just to buy her a seat at a private school she didn't earn. This wasn't a mistake. It was an organized heist. Mark didn't have any tears. He had rage. It was the ugly, impotent rage of a man who just realized his meal ticket had grown teeth. He let out a low, guttural growl and lunged across the table, his hand reaching for my phone like it was a lifeline. I didn't scream. I didn't even stand up at first. My training took over, moving my muscles before my brain could even process the threat. I slid my chair back, the wooden legs screeching against the floor, and rose in one fluid motion. I took a half step back, my feet finding a tactical stance, my hands coming up in a relaxed but ready guard. Mark stopped. He saw the way I was looking at him, not with fear, but with the clinical detachment of a sergeant identifying a target. He saw the coldness in my eyes, and he knew. He knew if he touched me, he wasn't going home to his recliner. He'd be going to the ER. He stood there, his chest heaving, smelling of stale coffee and desperation. You think you're so tough? He spat. You're gonna be nothing without us. You're just a grunt. You'll die in some hole in the dirt, and no one will even remember your name. I didn't answer him. Words are for people who still think they can negotiate. I reached down and grabbed my olive drab duffel bag from the floor. I pulled the zipper shut. The sound was a long, sharp reep that echoed through the kitchen, a final, metallic goodbye. From this second on, you don't exist to me, I said. I looked at Caroline, who was still trying to squeeze out more tears. Don't call the base. Don't send letters. Every single thing you have to say goes through David Caldwell. If you even think about touching that trust or coming within a mile of my post, I'll have a federal injunction on your door before the sun goes down. I swung the bag over my shoulder. The weight felt good. It felt honest. I walked out of that kitchen, my boots thudding heavy and rhythmic on the floorboards. I didn't look at the family photos on the wall. I didn't look at the home sweet home sign over the door. I walked out the front entrance and slammed the oak door behind me. The sound was a gunshot that shook the windows of Willow Creek. The air outside was crisp, smelling of wet pavement and the coming spring. I walked to my car, tossed the bag into the back seat, and started the engine. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. The retribution at Willow Creek didn't need my help. Without the infusion of my grandfather's cash, Mark's house of cards folded in 3 weeks. The bank sent a tow truck for that shiny F350 while he was still in his pajamas, the heavy chains rattling as they hauled his ego down the driveway. Skylar's dreams of Bucknell evaporated like mist. She ended up at the local community college, trading her designer sweatshirt for a uniform at the local diner to pay for books. As for Caroline, the country club she loved so much turned into a cage. When the news about Lance Briggs's disbarment and the lawsuit for breach of fiduciary duty hit the local papers, the invitations stopped coming. The heroic mother was exposed as a common thief. The roof was caving in on them, and it was the weight of their own greed that did the job. I was done with the war in the kitchen. But as I drove toward Pittsburgh, toward the only person left who knew the real story of why my father died, a new shadow began to fall. Aunt Beth had been waiting, and the truth she held was a knife I hadn't seen coming. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The campaign wasn't over. It was just moving to a darker front. Pittsburgh doesn't hide its scars. The steel mills might be quiet now, but the soot is still baked into the red bricks of the row houses, a permanent reminder of a city built on heat and heavy labor. I drove 4 hours through a gray Pennsylvania drizzle, the wipers slapping against the windshield with a steady, hypnotic rhythm. The heater in my old sedan was blasting, but the cold I'd brought from Willow Creek was still settled deep in my marrow. I pulled up in front of a small, narrow house on a steep hill. Aunt Beth was already standing on the porch, a silhouette against the warm yellow glow of the hallway light. She didn't say a word when I killed the engine. She didn't cry, and she didn't ask why my eyes looked like 2 burnt holes in a blanket. She just reached for my duffel bag and hauled it inside with a strength that belied her age. The house smelled of toasted garlic, old books, and the faint, sharp tang of floor wax. It was a real smell. A blue-collar smell. None of that fake lavender vanilla crap Caroline used to mask the rot in her own home. Beth pushed a plate of sourdough toast in front of me, the crust charred just right, dripping with salted butter. "Eat, Quinn," she said. Her voice was a low rasp, a sound shaped by 30 years of working the floor at a glass factory. She used my real name, no nicknames, no peanut. I sat there, my spine a rigid steel rod against the wooden chair, and I told her. I told her about the midnight signature, the encrypted line to Caldwell, the way Mark's face looked when the bank account turned into a ghost. I told her how I'd walked out of that kitchen while my mother was still trying to squeeze a few more drops of fake grief out of her eyes. Beth didn't look surprised. She didn't look shocked. She just leaned against the laminate counter, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of Earl Grey tea. She watched the fire in the small stone hearth, her eyes reflecting the orange lick of the flames. The wood hissed and popped, throwing tiny sparks against the iron screen. It was the first time in 3 days I didn't feel like I was scanning for an IED. "You did the right thing," Beth finally said. She set her mug down with a heavy thud. "But you ain't the first one that woman tried to hollow out." "She's been practicing for a long time, Quinn. She's a professional." She walked over to the mantel and picked up a framed photo. It was my dad. 2018. He was leaning against his beat-up Chevy, wearing a flannel shirt and a grin that I could still see when I closed my eyes. He looked solid. He looked like a man who thought he had all the time in the world. A month later, a jackknifed semi on Highway 30 took care of that. "When your father died, he didn't leave you with nothing," Beth said. She brought the photo over and set it on the table between the toast and the tea. He had a policy. $450,000 in life insurance. He told his lawyer he wanted it put in a restricted fund. He wanted you to have a choice, Quinn. He didn't want you stuck in some mill or scratching for change. I stopped chewing. The sourdough tasted like sawdust in my mouth. My heart gave a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. $450,000. I'd never seen a dime of it. I'd joined the army because I thought we were broke. I'd signed up for the hazard pay because Caroline told me the house was in foreclosure and she couldn't afford the heat. "Caroline did a hell of a job in that courtroom," Beth whispered, her lip curling into a sneer. She wore her blackest dress and cried until the judge couldn't see straight. She swore on her life she'd use that cash to raise you right. Private schools, a college fund, a head start. The judge felt sorry for the grieving widow. He bypassed the trust. He gave her the keys to the kingdom. I gripped the quay of my tea mug until my knuckles turned white. The heat from the Earl Grey seeped into my palms, but I was still freezing. "Where did it go?" I asked. My voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. Beth let out a short, jagged laugh that sounded like a dry cough. Mark Hollis happened. 1 year later, she was investing that cash into his rat hole construction company, sinking your father's ghost into granite countertops for strangers and a fleet of trucks they couldn't drive. They ate that money, Quinn. They ate your father's life, and then they came back to the table looking for yours. The silence that followed was absolute. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the low moan of the wind against the Pittsburgh hills. It all made sense now. The sacrifices Caroline kept screaming about. She hadn't sacrificed a thing. She'd been a vulture since the day the dirt hit my father's coffin. But Harold saw her, Beth continued, her eyes locking onto mine. Your grandfather watched her burn through that insurance money like it was kindling. He knew he couldn't stop her then, so he changed his own play. He sold the family farm in secret. He worked that clerk job until his hands wouldn't close. He built that $600,000 trust as a second line of defense. He knew she'd come for you again as soon as you hit 21. He knew she'd try to finish the job. I leaned back into the sofa, the old fabric scratching against my neck. I looked at the photo of my dad. The weight of the last few days finally hit me, but it wasn't heavy. It was a strange, cold clarity. I hadn't just been defending my bank account. I'd been finishing a war that started 6 years ago on a rainy stretch of Highway 30. I was the last soldier left on the field, and I was the only one who'd bothered to bring a map. I looked at Aunt Beth, the woman who'd kept this fire burning while I was overseas. She didn't offer me a hug. She didn't offer me a tissue. She just pushed the plate of toast closer. "Go on," she said. "Eat up. You got a whole new life to figure out tomorrow." I took a bite. The butter was cold now, but the salt was sharp. I looked at the flames and realized the campaign was over. The thieves were broke, the fortress was locked, and for the first time in my life, the air I was breathing belonged to me. But as I stared into the fire, I realized there was one thing Harold hadn't put in the trust. A piece of paper Beth was now pulling from the back of the photo frame. My blood turned to ice as I saw the handwriting. It wasn't my grandfather's. It was my father's, and it was dated the day he died. The phone buzzed on the nightstand of Aunt Beth's guest room, a number I didn't recognize. I've been getting a lot of those lately, mostly bill collectors in Pennsylvania looking for Mark Hollis or the woman of the house. They keep calling because the life they built was a house of cards, and I'm the one who finally blew it over. This message was different. It was from Skylar. I sat on the edge of the bed, the cold Pittsburgh morning air pressing against the glass. "Poppy, I'm sorry. I didn't know how bad it was until the bank showed up for the house. Mark and Mom are separated. I'm scared." I looked at the screen for a long time. She's 18. A kid who spent her entire life watching her mother pickpocket every soul in Willow Creek. She's watching her Bucknell dreams burn on the front lawn. In the field, you don't waste lead on someone who's already dropped their rifle. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel hate. I just felt nothing. No spark, no warmth. I typed back 6 words. "Coffee in a year, I'll drive." Nothing more. "No, I'm sorry. No, it'll be okay. Boundaries are like fences. You gotta keep 'em high or the wolves find their way back in." I hit send and watched the little bubble vanish into the digital void. Mark and Caroline weren't my war no more. I'd cut off their oxygen at 12:04 a.m. on my birthday, and now I was just watching the air run out from across the state. Without my father's ghost money to prop up his failing ego, Mark's construction company folded like a cheap plastic chair. The repo men came for the trucks. The lawyers took the equipment. I heard they were living in some 2-bedroom rental near the highway now, probably screaming at each other about who let the Mark get away. The biggest punishment for people like them isn't a courtroom, It's having to live the rest of their miserable lives without a sucker to bleed dry. They're stuck with each other. That's a life sentence I wouldn't wish on a stray dog. I stood up and started folding my uniform. The OCPs were stiff, smelling of Tide and the heavy industrial detergent Aunt Beth uses. I folded the sleeves into perfect, sharp blocks. I've always been good at making things square. It's how I survive. I don't let edges fray. Aunt Beth walked in, 2 mugs of Earl Grey in her hands. The steam curled up in the pale yellow sunlight that was finally breaking through the Pittsburgh clouds. She saw me stacking my gear. "How's the heart, Quinn?" she asked. She leaned against the doorframe, her gray hair tucked behind an ear. She didn't use the name Poppy. She knew I'd buried that girl in the mud back in Willow Creek. I looked out the window. The snow was finally melting on the curbs, turning into gray slush that ran into the sewers. For 20 years, silence was my armor. It was the thing I held onto while my mother lied and my stepfather grunted. It was the sound of an ambush waiting to happen in my own hallway. It was the sound of holding my breath so I wouldn't get hit. "It's quiet, Beth," I said. I took the mug and felt the heat seep into my palms. It didn't taste like betrayal. It didn't have that sickly sweet maple syrup tang of Caroline's fake birthday breakfast. It just tasted like hot water and tea leaves. "Quiet is good," she said, nodding slowly. "No," I said, looking her in the eye. "This ain't just quiet. This is the sound of the world finally shutting up. This is peace." She smiled, a real, weary smile, and left me to my packing. I grabbed my rucksack and my olive drab duffel. I'd packed everything I owned into it: my father's letters, Harold's secret will, 3 sets of uniforms, and the keys to a life that actually belonged to me. I reached for the zipper. Zip. It was a sharp, final sound. The sound of a mission closed. A perimeter secured. I'd fought a war in a kitchen, and I'd won without firing a single round. I didn't need their names. I didn't need their fake love. I had a trust fund they couldn't touch, and a future they couldn't see. My father's insurance money was gone, spent on Mark's trucks and Caroline's dresses, but I didn't care. I'd reclaimed the only thing that mattered: my own name. I walked out onto the porch. The air was cold, but it was mine. I didn't owe the world an explanation. I didn't owe them a single tear. I threw the duffel into the back seat and didn't look back at the hill. The road was open. The targets were neutralized. I turned the key and the engine roared to life. A beautiful, loud noise that filled the silence. If you've ever had to build your own fortress because the people who were supposed to protect you were the ones tearing it down, you aren't alone. If you finally found the strength to say no more and walk away from a toxic legacy, hit that like button right now. I want to hear your story. Comment the word "owned" if you've officially taken back the keys to your own life. Don't let them win. Stay silent, stay strong, and keep your eyes on the road. I shifted into drive and let off the brake. The tires gripped the wet asphalt as I headed toward the open highway. I had a long drive ahead of me, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't running away. I was just moving forward. The war was over. I was finally home. The engine hummed like a promise kept.